Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Dylan and Dave, for organizing this. So, in recent years, I guess we've all seen headlines like this. There's growing evidence that insects feel pain just like us. There is ample evidence that fish feel pain. Insects may feel pain. Says growing evidence, further evidence that crabs and other crustaceans feel pain. Recently, there was this declaration in New York, Declaration of Animal Consciousness, which prompted headlines such as a group of prominent scientists believes fruit flies, fish, and mollusks feel pain. More recently, there was, before that, there was this report which prompted a change in the UK law, which now recognizes lobsters, octopuses, and crabs as sentient beings. Of course, the key term in all those cases is evidence. Okay, we're told that there is evidence for these claims, scientific evidence preferably. Now, you might wonder, what is this evidence that apparently keeps growing? How could we know whether crabs, worms, or bees have feelings, for example, other animals? Now, as Dylan mentioned, the main method is a markers methodologies to determine which animals are conscious by determining whether animals can perform functions that we think require consciousness or are associated with consciousness. So first, find functions associated with consciousness, and then look at an animal, and if it can perform those functions, then you say conscious. Yeah. That's the markers methodology. Now, the question obviously is, well, then which functions require consciousness? Now, there are many functions commonly associated with consciousness in this literature. So I've compiled a list, which I've called the list. So, but here is a list. Trace conditioning, integrating information across sensory analysis, self-recognition in mirror, flexible planning, instrumental learning, responding to analytics, making motivation trade-offs, the ability to engage in play, memory, flexible self-protection, source memory, remembering which places are linked to nurture stimuli, rapid reversal learning, self-administering analgesics, metacognition, and so on and so on. So that's the list. In the literature, you'll find people nodding along to the list. Maybe some people will scratch a few out items, maybe people will add a few others, but that's the list. Okay, so the idea is that whenever you find some of those in non-human animals, that should increase your credence that the animal is conscious. Now, the question is, where is the list coming from? I mean, it has to come from somewhere. So I've been in this consciousness business for some time now, and I can tell you that there is no scientific evidence that I know of directly linking those functions to consciousness. So we don't have direct empirical studies of the kind I'm going to talk about later. It's just based on, spontaneous reasoning, intuitions. For example, we all have the intuition probably that, an unconscious animal wouldn't go around popping painkillers, and therefore self-administering analgesics sounds like a function associated with consciousness, but we don't have hard empirical evidence for this. Now, there's another VIP club of functions which have been validated by empirical evidence. So there's really two kinds of sources of evidence for functions on the list. Now, I'm going to argue that we have no reason to accept anything like the list. The functions that make it onto the list because of intuition, I think our intuitions are bad. They're often based on fallacious reasoning. And second, I think those studies that make it onto the list because of empirical evidence shouldn't be on the list for 99% of them, because most of the empirical research is confounded. I'm going to explain what the confound is, what the problem is with the empirical evidence. So my conclusion will be that current evidence of sentience is deeply unreliable, and animal sentience research is largely built on STEM. Okay, so let me start with fallacious reasoning. So one might spontaneously have the thought, I can perform many functions while having conscious states, and therefore my conscious experiences must be relevant for performing those functions. So that illustrates what I call the consciousness-only fallacy. It's the fallacy of concluding that consciousness is functionally relevant for a function just because a conscious state correlates with the performance of that function. So let me give you an example. Suppose I have the spontaneous intuition that as I reach to grab something, it's my conscious state that is functionally relevant for guiding the action as it goes. Okay? So if you move my laptop a bit to the left, I'll see that consciously and adjust my grasp, okay, the way I grasp my laptop. Now, there's very good evidence that this spontaneous intuition is wrong. Some of you might know this from the two visual streams hypothesis. Here's my favorite example indicating this. So that's using the hollow face illusion. The hollow face illusion, you can make a concave face appear convex and vice versa. Okay. So what Michel and colleagues did is that they had a 3D model of this illusion, and they put targets on those faces. And they had two conditions. Either you draw the position of the target, tell me how far it is from you. And here you see the result. You see that the illusion works. A convex face appears concave. Okay. And then they had a different condition. They had a different condition in which they asked people to flick the targets off of the face. Okay. And what they found is that in the flicking task, you don't have the illusion. Okay. It's just the same as for a true hollow face. So that's a case where conscious perception represents a concave face as convex, and vision for action accurately represents the concave face as concave. So you might have the intuition that conscious vision correlates with action guidance, and therefore it's functionally relevant for action guidance, but that would be wrong. And that's wrong. Why? Because of the consciousness-only fallacy. Just because the conscious state correlates with function doesn't imply that the conscious state is functionally relevant for that function. Here's another intuitive thought you might have. My conscious states seem to be involved in the performance of many functions, and therefore consciousness must be required for performing those functions. So I think there's also a trap lurking here, which is what I call the consciousness first fallacy. So fallacy of concluding that a function requires consciousness just because conscious states are relevant for performing that function. So it's slightly more subtle than the other fallacy. The other fallacy, the consciousness-only fallacy, is just a classic blunder of confusing correlation for relevance. This is slightly more subtle. So let me explain. A good example of this is working memory maintenance. So here's a classical example of a working memory task. You're presented a stimulus with a certain orientation, then it's masked. You're presented a second one with a different orientation. And then there's a cue indicating which orientation you're going to report. A probe, you adjust that probe to match the orientation, and then you get feedback. Okay? So you have to maintain that in your working memory. Now, it might seem intuitive, and I've done many of these myself, and if you do that, you'll really feel like you're maintaining the orientation in your head. So you might think that you perform the task by consciously maintaining an image of the stimulus in your mind. Okay. So just assume that's the case. It's in virtue of consciously maintaining the image in your mind, the orientation in your mind, that you perform the task. Does that mean that working memory maintenance requires conscious, as opposed to maybe unconscious, mental imagery? So there's reason to doubt this. There's reason to doubt this. For one thing, if you ask people with different degrees of reported imagery vividness, you will not find any effect on performance on this task. So it seems like imagery vividness has no impact. Another thing is that if you take people who are aphantasics, so people who report no visual imagery whatsoever, they'll still be able to perform the task just as well. Not only that, but you're also going to be able to decode the orientation from visual cortex. Okay? So it does seem like they encode visual representations, but it doesn't feel like anything to them. So it's just one of the many cases indicating unconscious working memory maintenance. So that means that the conscious state, in that case, conscious mental imagery being relevant for a function, namely working memory maintenance, does not imply that the function requires consciousness. Maybe you could do it in virtue of having a non-conscious mental state. So that illustrates the consciousness first fallacy. So David Rosenthal noted that psychological states have many properties that contribute to their causal powers, and so may result in the states having some distinctive function. Being conscious may be one such property, but it is by no means the only one. psychological states also differ in respect of representational content and other psychological properties. So even for conscious states, we must distinguish that aspect of their function due specifically to their being conscious as opposed to unconscious from those aspects which are due to other psychological features of the state. So this consciousness first fallacy, just because conscious state is a function, doesn't mean that this function is in virtue of being a conscious state as opposed to an unconscious state. So the upshot is that if it seems intuitively obvious to you that an animal wouldn't be able to perform a function if it were not conscious, think twice. Think twice. You still don't have a good idea of what the unconscious can do. As Spinoza said a long, long time ago, we don't know what the body can do. We don't know what the body can do independently of the soul. We don't know what the unconscious can do. So when we say that this or that function is due to consciousness, we don't know what we're saying. What we need is empirical evidence. Empirical evidence. So based on that, I think there's no evidence that the majority of the functions that people think are associated with consciousness are indeed associated with consciousness. But what about the VIP club of functions associated with consciousness? Here, I think there's a very, very important empirical confound, and I'm going to explain what that is now. So as Dylan mentioned, the general method for finding functions associated with consciousness empirically is to compare conscious perception, for example, to unconscious perception, and then you see what you can do consciously and what you cannot do unless perception is conscious. Okay, so here are various consciousness suppression methods. Here's one method, visual or sandwich masking, where you put meaningless patterns and then a word and then more meaningless patterns. What's going to happen is that you're going to see that word, but unconsciously because it's sandwiched between those two other meaningless things that come very, very fast before and after the target. And you can manipulate consciousness by manipulating how long this is presented before and before the second pass. Another method is also mentioned by Dylan, was to is called continuous flash suppression. So in one eye, you're presented with this very, very salient pattern. In the other eye, you're presented, for example, with an angry face. And the idea is that this one will be processed unconsciously, while you only consciously experience this because it's so salient. So the method works like this. You're going to compare conscious versus unconscious perception. The functions that can be performed unconsciously are not associated with consciousness. And the functions that you can perform only in the conscious condition are going to be deemed associated with consciousness. So here's an example, a case study with instrumental conditioning. So instrumental conditioning is learning to associate an action with a reward or avoiding punishment. So this is an old video from Skinner. So you can hear the voices of Skinner if you have the sound, saying that he's conditioned pigeons to play ping pong. So he gets reward whenever he makes a shot. So the question is, does this require consciousness? Is it evidence that the pigeons really consciously experience the ball? So many people think that there is very good empirical evidence that instrumental conditioning indeed requires consciousness. And this has now made its way in the animal sentience research, when Birch, for example, and colleagues say that instrumental learning seems to have a particularly strong link to sentience, and that's used in this report that later influenced UK law. So the example we're going to talk about here is a study in which they wanted to see if you can learn the association between seeing a certain stimulus as opposed to a different stimulus and pressing a button, pressing a bar unconsciously. Can you do that unconsciously? So here's the experiment. We're going to go through this. Suppose we want to learn the association. We want you to learn the association between seeing a symmetrical stimulus and pressing a bar, even when the symmetrical stimulus is unconscious. Here's how they do this. They're going to put a mask here, that's sandwich masking. And the target can be either a symmetric or asymmetric figure. Then after that, the way they make it conscious or unconscious is by varying this time, how long the target is presented. After that, you'll have to decide to press the bar or not. And then, if you press the bar, you'll get a reward if the stimulus was symmetric. So we're going to reinforce you. to press the bar when it was symmetric, and you're going to be punished when it was asymmetric. You're going to lose virtual money. And then after that, they have a discrimination decision to make sure you didn't see the stimulus. The idea is that if you saw it consciously, you should be above chance at telling whether it was symmetric or asymmetric. If you saw it unconsciously or didn't see it consciously, you should be at chance for saying whether it was symmetric or asymmetric. So we should expect 50% performance, like chance performance, for saying whether the stimulus was symmetric or asymmetric in the unconscious condition. So the question is, can subjects learn to press the bar when they see the symmetrical stimulus, even if they do not see it consciously? And so this is plotting the proportion of correct responses across time for the conscious condition. So in the conscious condition, people do learn to see the proportion of correct responses. It's pressing the bar when you see the symmetrical stimulus, not pressing the bar when you see the asymmetrical stimulus. And this is the unconscious condition. So you can see there's a clear learning. They press the bar more and more when it's conscious, but no learning, or at least no evidence of learning in the unconscious condition. So this is why researchers believe that instrumental learning is associated with consciousness. Now, does this show what the study claims to show? My answer is no, it doesn't show that. Why? Because there's a trivial alternative explanation, really trivial alternative explanation. In one condition, you can discriminate symmetric versus asymmetric. In the other condition, you can't discriminate symmetric and asymmetric. So the study really shows that you can't learn based on visual targets, you can't discriminate. But if you think about it for 5 seconds, this is totally unsurprising. How could I learn to press a button when I see the symmetric versus asymmetric stimulus if I don't see the difference between the two? Okay. Okay. I don't see the difference between symmetric and asymmetric, therefore I can't learn to press the button when I see the symmetrical stimulus. Maybe this doesn't have anything to do with consciousness. So we have two alternative interpretations. The one non-trivial explanation is that instrumental conditioning requires consciousness. And the other one is that it requires correctly seeing the cues on the basis of which one is supposed to learn. My explanation is better. Why? Because it's trivial. We already accept it. Okay. It's like asking me to perform the experiment by closing my eyes on some trials and being surprised, oh, Matthias can't perform the experiment when he closes his eyes. It's basically what the mask is doing. The mask is just as good as closing your eyes. Now, I think this worry generalizes to nearly all experiments studying the functions associated with consciousness. Unconscious perception is almost always achieved by decreasing discrimination capacities to the point that visual states become basically non-functional. And as a result, almost all results showing that unconscious perception is ineffective for some tasks are totally unsurprising. Why? Because it's by making it ineffective that you've made it unconscious. It's by making it ineffective that you've made it unconscious. So here's another way to look at it. Here's the standard research on the functions of consciousness. Here's how it goes. First, you create a condition in which you see the stimulus clearly. Then you create a second condition where signal processing associated with the stimulus is severely degraded. You're going to mask it. You're going to put something moving very, very fast in the other eye, and so on and so forth. And then, shocking news! There are things you can do when you see the stimulus clearly that you can't do when signal processing is severely degraded. Okay. This is not shocking news. This is sarcastic. So, investigating the functions of normal seeing is not the same thing as investigating the functions of consciousness. Unsurprisingly, there are functions associated with normal seeing, with what happens when you see the stimulus clearly. This is not the same as studying functions associated with consciousness. So, unequal discrimination capacities between conscious and unconscious conditions is a severe confounding factor. And empirical results in this area do not show that function F requires consciousness most of the time. They just show that subjects cannot perform F when stimuli are indiscriminable or poorly discriminable, which is trivial. Now, let me address two objections. First objection, but Matthias, you're just begging the question. Just begging the question, Matthias, that's bad, don't do that. Why am I begging the question? You might think, well, being able to discriminate and consciousness are the same thing. So discrimination capacities are not the confounding factor. Here's the second objection, but Matthias, you're asking for a non-reasonably high standard of evidence. Surely this gives us some evidence, but even if it's not your super high standard of evidence. So let me address those two objections, starting with this one. So the idea would be that consciousness itself might be systematically related to discriminability. So discriminability, from this perspective, is not a confounding factor. As my friend Hakwan Lau says, it would be like considering that bone length is a confounding factor when studying size differences between people. So I am not making the question. I'm not making the question. Why? Because discriminability can vary independently of consciousness. And so studying which functions require high discriminability is not the same as studying which functions require consciousness. Those who know me will not be surprised to see blindsight here. Okay, so I'm going to give a few cases of dissociations. So blindsight is the presence of visual abilities in the absence of reported visual experience, which is observed in patients with lesions of primary visual cortex at the back of the head, where the visual signals first enter the cortex after subcortical processing. Yeah, so there's a wide variety of visual abilities preserved in blindsight. They can discriminate shape, movement, or colors. They can perform visually guided actions to targets they don't report seeing. They can identify facial expressions, and when they do, that will trigger basic emotional responses quite unconsciously. They can even attend to visual targets they deny seeing, and they can learn on the basis of visual targets they deny seeing. So here's an example. Here's GY studied by Larry Weisbrand, indicating with his arm, mimicking the movement of a dot on the screen. Can't see it properly. So he claims, so this is in his blind visual field, so he claims he doesn't see the targets.
Right. Graham, can you tell me what sort of experience you had that made you move your arm?
I just know something's moving over in the right field.
Can you describe it?
No, it's just I know there's some movement there.
And what did you actually see?
I didn't see anything.
So what did you actually see? I didn't see anything. So here are a few examples of dissociations between discriminability and performance in blindsight. Here's this plotting, that's awareness, reported awareness in the blind visual field versus discrimination for discriminating whether this dot is moving up or to the right. Okay. And as you can see, as reported awareness goes down, as you decrease the contrast of the stimulus, performance remains pretty much quite the same. Okay, it's just as good at telling you whether the stimulus is doing this or this, but as contrast goes down, his reported awareness goes down. So that's a case where there's no correlation apparently between discriminability and consciousness. Here's another example using first order and second order stimuli, or luminance-defined stimuli and texture-defined stimuli. So GY will report, discrimination, detection task, will perform pretty much the same for both kinds of stimuli, but he will report different levels of awareness for those two different kinds of stimuli. Here's a clear case. So in this case, they're changing the spatial frequency, the detection task for the two kinds of stimuli. GY never reports seeing this kind of stimulus. He reports seeing this kind of stimulus pretty much all the time when there's low spatial frequency. And if you increase the spatial frequency, reported awareness goes way down. But performance stays pretty much the same. Discrimination performance doesn't care about whether it's conscious or unconscious. So that's the case of, where performance, discrimination performance, and consciousness come apart. Here's a case in healthy subjects, so that's without blindsight. So this case is using the attentional blink. In the attentional blink, if I present a target and then a second target, something like 300 milliseconds after it, if you saw the first target, you're often going to miss the second target. So here's how it works. So there's lag 1. Lag 1 means that the second target is presented here. Lag 3 means the second target is presented here. Lag 6 means the second target is presented here. And you can see that performance for identifying the target goes down at lag 3. Okay? So people are bad at identifying the target when it comes right after. Now, the important thing is that there's this phenomenon called lag 1 sparing, which means that if you present the second target right after the first one, people will be very good at identifying the second target. So if it's right after, people will be good at identifying second target. Now, in this study by Incham et al., what they did is more interesting than just that. They also asked for visibility ratings for the second target. And when you do that, what you find is that visibility for the second target is the same in lag 1 and lag 3, even though performance is very, very different between those two cases. Okay? So lag 1 sparing spares discriminability, but not subjective visibility. So that's another dissociation. If you're into confidence ratings, and why not? There's the same result by Recht and colleagues showing that there's a big dissociation between reported confidence and performance in this phenomenon. So again, I'm not begging the question. Discriminability can vary independently of consciousness, and studying which functions require high discriminability is not the same as studying which functions require consciousness. Now, that means that nearly all studies claiming to identify functions associated with consciousness simply show that some functions can't be performed based on indiscriminable stimuli, which is again trivial. Okay, doesn't tell us anything about consciousness. Second thing, Matthias, you're asking for an unreasonable standard of evidence. No, I'm not asking for the impossible. We can study which functions are associated with consciousness and not which functions are associated with discriminability. And here I'm going to very quickly provide two methods for doing that. The first one is going to be called matched performance paradigms, and the second one is dissociation paradigms. Now, I'm hopeful that we can do that in healthy subjects. Here I'm just going to present evidence from blindsided subjects. So the experiment I'm interested in was carried out by Navin Raperso and Taquan Lau with patient GY, who you already met, the guy in the video earlier. Here, the task was just to say whether the vertical gratings was up or down. So in this case, it's up. In this case, it's down. And what they did is that they did this task in the two visual fields. In blind visual field, where GY reports not seeing anything consciously, and in the sighted visual field. In order to make that slightly more interesting, what they did is that they changed the contrast of the stimulus such that it was just as difficult to discriminate in the sighted visual field and the blind visual field. Okay? So we get conditions of matched discriminability. Now, it's just as good in the two visual fields for telling you whether the stimulus is vertical grating is up or down. So matched performance between the two visual fields. But obviously, GY almost never reports seeing the stimulus in the blind field, but it does report seeing the stimulus in the sighted visual field, as one might expect. So matched performance, but different awareness between the two visual fields. Okay. So in the second version of this task, instead of asking GY whether he saw the stimulus or not, they evaluated whether metacognition is facilitated by consciousness by asking GY, would you be ready to place a bet on your response? Okay. Would you bet some money that you got it right? So if consciousness facilitates metacognition, we should find that the rate of advantageous bets should be higher in the normal field compared to the blind field, even given matched performance, where here an advantageous bet is understood as bet when you're correct and don't bet when you're wrong. Okay. Otherwise, you'll lose money. Now, here's the interesting thing, is that GY is willing to bet on its responses in the blind visual field. Now, you might wonder why that's the case. Well, the reason why that's the case is because GY knows he has blind sight. So suppose, and he knows he can be like 90% correct in the blind field. So suppose I'm telling you, you can bet on this, But and you know, well, I got a pretty good chance of being right, even though I feel I don't see anything. You could bet with your eyes closed, right? Now, what interests us is not the proportion of bets overall. What interests us is the proportion of advantageous bets. Okay? And if you compare the proportion of advantageous bets between the cited and non-cited visual fields, what you find is this huge difference. Okay, so sub-threshold in the blind visual field, GY is losing money. Why? Because although he bets, he doesn't bet when he's right at a higher rate than when it's wrong. Okay, so he's losing money. You could money pump GY slash overly confident. So this result suggests that metacognition, the function facilitated by consciousness, and note that this doesn't have the problem of the previous studies because this controls for differences in discriminability between the two visual fields. Okay, it's much better than the other cases. Now let's go through dissociation paradigms and then I'll be done. Here's an example of what I mean by dissociation paradigms. So it's again with patient GY, investigating the difference between performance in the blind and normal visual field. That's an experiment by Perso and Coe. So in this case, the task was to indicate whether this stimulus was in the upper quadrant of the screen or lower quadrant. And they did, of course, the task in the normal field and in the blind field. Now, this is very easy for GY. Okay, he can do that perfectly well in the normal field and blind field. Here's now the, oh yeah, of course, as you decrease the contrast, it's going to get worse, because the stimulus is more difficult to see. Now, the interesting task in this experiment is what we call the exclusion task. Instead of asking GY where the stimulus is, now they just ask him where is the stimulus not present? Okay. The upper quadrant or lower quadrant. Of course, in his cited visual field, GY can do this perfectly well, even with low contrast. But in his blind visual field, he cannot do this. He cannot tell you where the stimulus is not. He's going to systematically tell you where the stimulus is. Okay? Not only that, but as you increase the contrast of the stimulus such that it's now more visible, GY doesn't get better, it gets worse. Okay? It gets worse and worse and worse as you increase the contrast of the stimulus. So we get a dissociation here between the effect of increasing the visibility of the stimulus in the blind visual field and in the sighted visual field. In the sighted visual field, it gets better, as any of us would. In the blind visual field, it gets worse. Okay? It gets worse at telling you where the stimulus is not. The stimulus strength increases, and presumably discriminability with it. GY becomes worse in its blind field, but better in the normal field. So we get a dissociation between the effects of increasing contrast in the two visual fields, and that suggests an effect of consciousness on the capacity to exclude, maybe. Not just an effect of the stimulus or signal strength or discriminability. Okay, my conclusion. I think that we should not accept the list, as you might have guessed. Why? Because spontaneous intuitions, spontaneous reasoning on the matter, I think is very unreliable. We have all kinds of biases. For one thing, we are not aware of the unconscious processes going on. So it's very easy for us to conclude that nothing is going on unconsciously. But it's just because we are not aware of it. And then the second reason is that 99% of the empirical studies claiming that some functions are associated with consciousness are confounded. What they just do is telling you which functions are associated with normal seeing, with good seeing, with good discrimination capacities, not consciousness. Those two things are different. But I think we can do better. Okay? We can do better, for example, by developing performance match paradigms, by finding other cases where consciousness goes one way, but performance goes the other way, and so on and so forth. All right, so that's it.
I'm just finishing 5 minutes early. So I have a question for you. And the successful paradigms you mentioned, I don't see how any of them could apply to animals, because
Well, they apply to monkeys, to blindside monkeys. But yeah,
Even exclusion in blindside monkeys?
yeah.
Really?
Well, it's
You could tell a monkey not to do it?
yeah, they can learn this role. Of course, the reason why people don't do this in monkeys as much as it's very difficult to do, you need to train the monkeys. The only case where I know this works is in a study that is not published because unfortunately it took so long. The monkeys died. and so one of the two monkeys, and so they had the data and so on, but you know,
Data?
it's just so it was in Tadashi Isa's lab in Japan, was one of the only people with blindside monkeys. And yeah, they wanted to do this exclusion test, but even better than that, because they wanted to, so you know, in blindside, if you increase the contrast enough, you're going to see the stimulus consciously. They're going to see the stimulus consciously. So what they wanted to find is a kind of error in the data where all of a sudden, as you increase the contrast enough, it gets worse and worse and worse, and all of a sudden you increase the contrast and boom, it gets much better because all of a sudden it crosses the threshold for functional perception. So that would be
Cool.
the expected result.
Yeah.
In other animals, it's very difficult.
That?
So I was wondering, might there be reason to think discriminability is often a good predictor of consciousness in typical and non-pathological cases, even if it fails to predict consciousness in blindsided and paradigms like detection blank? I guess I was wondering, or I sort of worried that you know, that this only shows that discriminability is an imperfect predictor and that the correlation between discriminability and consciousness isn't maybe as strong as we might have thought. Not that there is no correlation or that we should never use discriminability as a proxy for consciousness while acknowledging the potential confound.
Yeah, I mean, in most of the cases where you know, if you perform a dance with clearly visible stimuli, for example, suppose there's a big swirl occurring in the middle of the screen and you have to press a button whenever it's present. In that particular case, yeah, discriminability is definitely a good indicator. But when we're trying to study which functions are associated with consciousness specifically, I think we really need to be careful about this because again, even in healthy subjects, they do dissociate from one another. So it's just that we have those two variables. I agree with you that most of the time they are going to correlate. But if we really want to be precise and focus on consciousness itself, one is a confounding factor when we try to study the other. Another thing is, you know, in those cases, in those studies, stimuli are presented at threshold. So it's it's a whole different game in a sense, because you can't assume that what is true for normal perception is also going to be true for those very fine-grained threshold experiments. Yeah.
Just a follow-up on, thank you for a great talk, but just a follow-up on Matt's question. It seems the only method you would accept involves some sort of report.
Yeah.
Even if a man might be some sort of subjective report.
Yeah.
So you think that there is no evidence for consciousness that could be given by non-report paradigm?
No, I think we can. I agree with Dylan that we should start at home, develop indicators in humans, and then, well, in the animals we know are conscious, and then extend those functions. Oh, are you an illusionist now?
To start out because so even for monkeys.
Well, I know I'm conscious. And then try to extend those indicators to other animals, maybe closer to us. Another thing is that we can get reports or quasi reports in non-human animals. Here the cool case where Megan Peters had this experiment with rats where they saw a stimulus, and then of course they can't tell you whether they saw it or not. But what they can do is decide to wait for a reward if they get it right, or initiate the next trial immediately by pressing a button. Okay, so the choice is betting your time, basically. You can get them to bet time. If they think they got it right, they should be willing to wait for the reward. And if they think, well, it's really 50-50, they should initiate the next trial because there's a very good chance they won't get the reward after waiting. Okay. And what they found is that you can get some of the effects on confidence that we find in humans. some confidence biases and so on and so forth. So we could adapt methods like this with betting to non-human animals, I think quite successfully.
This would exclude quite a lot of humans too. You cannot train an infant, even
yeah, it's difficult. Yeah. But again, we can extend the indicators we already have to other animals. Right? Human babies.
Thanks, Matthias. That was really interesting. So I guess I have a question about the metacognitive paradigm. So that it went a little quick for me what exactly it showed, but I guess I was thinking that on your view, should a zombie not be able to perform metacognitive tasks? So because one way to think about problematic with these experiments is that it's really hard to make an inference about A consciousness and B consciousness.
Yeah.
So it looks on your view, if you're not demanding too much empirical evidence, then it should follow that zombies can't perform metacognition tasks. So I was just wondering if you could say something.
Well, I can't make claims about what zombies would be able to do because, well, they're conceivable but impossible. Will you say the same? At some point, Ned's password was for accessing NYU thing was zombie impossible. No, I mean, here's one thing. Even if I try to imagine being a zombie, here's one thing that should seem weird to me. I think I would be able to, do discrimination tests, but it would be weird to be able to tell you whether I forgot my glasses or not, for example, whether my experiences feel blurry or not, which is a kind of metacognition, because it really seems like it's a property of my experience, and if I didn't have that phenomenology, I wouldn't be able to tell you whether things feel blurry. Of course, you can imagine for any situation a zombie doing it just as well as you would, but just because zombies are considered. Yes.
Really nice question. A very quick clarification. When you were talking about the match performance, in one of the figures, when you said that actually they have access in the right, it seemed that it was below 50% still.
Yeah.
So that is questionable, right? So I don't know if you
so in the
that slide, but if chance is 50% and there's
in the dissociation paradigm.
Yeah.
In the dissociation paradigm, the point is they become worse than chance.
No, that was
Oh, that was not the dissociation
you can
paradigm.
print the slide. Maybe I misunderstood what you were saying, but I want to make sure.
This one?
No.
This one?
Uh-oh. Wait, there was, you were seeing that in the blind field, the subjective report was super low.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oops. Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah.
There. So if you see the right, the percent of trials that they have seen,
yeah,
it's still below 50.
Yes.
And so I think if chance is 50, then
so here's
it's different than blind.
No, it's a biased report in the sense that the stimulus is always present. So it's not a matter of chance performance because it's just you have the opportunity to report on every trial. Yeah.
Yeah, they lost it in the normal field.
Yeah.
More than half of the time.
Yeah, right. Because because in order to match performance, you need to make the stimuli super.
75%. That's very surprising. I mean, if you're at 75%.
So maybe they have a.
You should have seen it.
Yeah, maybe there's a bit of a conservative bias in the normal visual field.
It seems pretty conservative.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
And just a quick comment in reference to the question of claviology. I think maybe I'm going to talk about that, but I think having these no report markers, we have to be very cautious about it, right? Because there's things happening in the brain and in the eye movements that do not correlate that with your alert perception. So just have that little caution.
Yeah, thanks. That was great. So a question about this match performance kind of experiments. My problem with it is that it seems to presuppose that we are able to agree quite well unconsciously that we can with consciousness. And that may be the case, but it's a presupposition which is an issue. And then when I think of what kinds of data is there, on the blind side and happens experimental per se, there's nothing, right? Yeah, right.
I
So,
wouldn't say.
well, give me a list.
Well, that's the
But,
attentional blink stuff I was mentioning.
yeah,
Inflation.
so there's a few experiments of this kind. And they feel very official to me because, for instance, you have to leverage properties of meta contrast masking to make it so that you can match difference between conditions for people before they've seen something and conditions for people who fail to report that. And so later, I'll talk about a different approach to this, which consists of ditching masking altogether and figuring out just how much energy you need to achieve a particular discrimination, right? This leverages ultra short durations that make it possible to achieve invisibility without using masking. And so far, what we find with that is that lots of stuff that were described as possibly being carried out with other ways seem to be required when you get rid of masking.
Yeah.
So just beginning to be like,
Well, it's just I agree with you that those actually I've seen a talk by a certain excellent journals making the case that it's very, very difficult to turn consciousness off.
yeah.
And that's the problem, right? That in order to turn consciousness off, either we go to these cases of blindsight, which are suboptimal also because the guy has a lesion, so it's not like a normal case. It's not just performance minus consciousness or everything normal minus consciousness. We have to mask, we have to do all kinds of things. But it's just because the reason why that's the case, it's not necessarily because consciousness and discriminability always go hand in hand. It might just be because consciousness is well designed such that you can't have like super strong stimuli that go totally under the radar in most cases. But I mean, it's just one of these areas where we need just more work on this.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of in the same spirit. I think a lot of people who think about conscious and unconscious perception say, sure, you get all this connection with this correlation between consciousness and discriminability, precisely because one of the functions of consciousness is to enhance discriminability or to enhance performance. And that's, you might say, well, what about blindside? To say that X enhances Y isn't to say that X is necessary and sufficient for Y. So it's consistent with there being all kinds of special cases where the enhancement is defeated. So I'm just wondering where that kind of view ends up standing, especially if it turns out those cases are relatively rare, as Axel is suggesting.
Yeah, I mean that's I think that's a case where the cases I've mentioned, I think, are not only cases where you find that there's no enhancement, but cases that go against the enhancement prediction. Because if you watch this again, these goes here, for example, you should expect that you're much better if you get enhancements in the other cases as well. And I think the cases of dissociation paradigms that I mentioned, where you increase visibility and people get worse, are also going to go against an enhancement view. I mean, again, it's you can argue these are rare cases and so on and so forth. But there's a good reason why they're rare cases. Again, it's because consciousness is designed in a way that the two will go together most of the time, even if they're not the same.
I mean, this connects to Dylan's point about whether functions have to be necessary and nothing's quite consistent to say actually part of the function of X is that increasing X will enhance Y, even though there are certain weird conditions where it goes the other way, increasing X diminishes Y. So it seems to me that kind of weak view of the function of consciousness.
Note that this is totally ad hoc, though. Right? You're going to say, well, I'm going to give you evidence that it's not the case, that your hypothesis is false, and you're going to say, well, but it's one of those weird cases that where the two go opposite directions or something like that. But in the other cases, I swear, in the other cases they go together.
You don't want something which is going on in those cases. This actually connects to the other point. It's the same old point I was making in the other talk, which is that actually you said 99% of cases involve a confound, where the confound is with discriminability. I'm finding 100% of cases involve the confound, where the confound is access consciousness.
Oh, I disagree with that.
Yeah.
I disagree with that because I think there are cases of access consciousness without phenomenal consciousness. In the case of, for example, in this case, in the case of, yes, in this case, I think that's a case of access consciousness without phenomenal consciousness. Why? Because the best explanation for the lag one effect is that this is encoded in working memory. And so people are able to,
I mean, it's certainly not reportable, so if we're finding access consciousness.
in terms of
In
report.
terms of report,
Well, the identity of the stimulus is reportable, but yeah. So that would be the confounding factor would be introspectability. Yeah, more than just cognitive access.
which is a form of access, so yeah, you're still gonna have that kind of confound in that vicinity of what would report.
Yeah, once we get there, I think I'm just going to ask for a theoretical reason for thinking that they might dissociate.
Let's see. Well, several animal species have passed the self-awareness test, recognize themselves in the mirror. Since you're open to some animals having consciousness, do you see some possible correlation between the self-awareness and consciousness in animals?
That's a good question. Last time I looked at the literature of the mirror test was a paper by Gallup and Anderson who invented the test. And they were mentioning that the literature is very unclear actually on what these cases show. I really don't know whether that's a function that requires consciousness, self-recognition. Let me just mention a few factors that make these studies difficult to interpret. Often it's not clear whether they're recognizing themselves or conspecific. The way animals interact with mirrors is very weird. So certainly not passing it is certainly not evidence that they don't have consciousness. Another thing is that, for example, in the fish, there was this report that this species of fish passes the mirror test, but it's actually probably the main explanation is probably that they put a marker on the fish, and maybe that's irritating, and therefore they try to scratch it. They rub their face. They rub their face against something. Yeah. Yeah, with their hand. Fish don't have hands.
Oh, thanks, Matthias. Yes, this is a great talk. I really admire everything you do, although I disagree with some parts of it. So I really, I'm willing to go a long way with the questioning the skeptical attitude towards functional role of consciousness. But I think that leaves us with two widely different, sort of pathways. Well, at least two. One of which is like, say, it's a very rarefied phenomenon. Consciousness is a rarefied phenomenon. It's related to metacognitive capacities that are very rare in the animal kingdom. But even we'd also say the opposite and say, well, let's just sort of disconnect these two and say, no, it's everywhere. It's kind of like, it has low cost. Consciousness is sort of like omnipresent, and that opens the door to panpsychism and so on. So why does the skepticism towards functional consciousness not open the door to very widely different interpretations, or does it open?
So you're saying that one way of interpreting what I've been saying is that all of this research is crap and we should just stop it. Yeah, I don't think that should be the right way of interpreting it. I think the right way of interpreting it is that we have a lot of work to do before we're able to claim that some functions are indeed associated with consciousness. Here I'm using metacognition, but I happen to have the view that metacognition is very important for consciousness, but I could imagine someone who doesn't accept that view, but will also consider that metacognition is one of several markers of consciousness. And maybe if we work hard and try to solve the problems with the confound I've been talking about, maybe we'll discover that other functions are associated with consciousness, maybe some kinds of learning or things like that. And then we can use those other functions to find out whether or not human animals are conscious or not. So skeptic only in the sense that I think we need to search more, not a skeptic in the sense that there's no answer or that anything goes.
Just very small clarificatory question about the trace conditioning study.
Yeah.
So they didn't.
It's Instrumental conditioning.
Instrumental conditioning. So they didn't control for discriminability, right?
No, you can't discriminate the stimulus in the unconscious condition.
You cannot.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do we know that? Do they?
They're 50-50, but
Oh, I see. Okay. So that's it.
yeah. I mean, obviously there's a type 2 error there because being 50% doesn't mean that you're really 50%. Yeah.
Go.
Hi, Matthias. I have a question. Personally, how to define consciousness? Because I see that are you trying to define consciousness, the functions, and then define consciousness through the function, or you have like a base on which you define consciousness, and then you go from there and describe what is consciousness through its functions.
So I think the definition of consciousness is quite vague. But it's just I define it as subjective experience of there being something is like rather than nothing is like. The way I like to think about it is that we start with contrast cases and then define consciousness by examples like this. So that's Eric Fitzgerald's approach. So for example, there's nothing it feels like for you to monitor your blood oxygen levels right now. But there is a structure in your brain that monitors that. Here's another case I like. Right now, there's the way the eye is constructed is very weird because the blood vessels actually obscure the light coming in. And in monkeys, with our studies showing that we can actually decode those shadows cast on the retina by retinal blood vessels. But of course, even if you do register the presence of these shadows, you don't spend your whole life with like giant spiders on your eyes. So that's another case where there's information registration without consciousness. And I think if we have enough examples like this, you can get a grasp of, well, what's the difference between the two, and then we can study this contrast. But I really want to start from the contrast we're interested in, and then build from that.
Go.
So this is just following on Ollie's question about the instrumental conditioning. See, I don't think I entirely followed the experiments either. Yeah. So basically my question is like, did either these studies or could you design a study where you mask stimulus sufficiently to make it unconscious, but not so much as to make it indiscriminable?
Yeah.
And because if you could do that, that should be grist to your mill, right? Yeah. Are you aware of such studies?
So there's a study in blindsided monkeys where they do get unconscious instrumental conditioning.
Right.
Here's how it works. The blindsided monkeys don't see anything in their right visual field, and there's a hidden target, which is an area of the screen where they have to learn to make an eye movement, a saccade. Okay. So they want them to saccade to this particular area of the screen when and only when there's a cube, which is also in the blind field, appearing. And what they find is that the monkeys learn to saccade to this area only when there's this cube. Not only that, a cool thing in this experiment is that usually when you find something you're searching for, you start looking for it. And if you look at the monkey's behavior in the blind field, they saccade right on target, they stop there for 1 second, and then they continue looking for the target. Which really indicates that, if it was conscious, it would be such weird behavior. And I think that's also related to metacognition. Like they succeed, but they don't know they've succeeded.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That's very persuasive. I guess I was thinking like in the sort of like non-lesion cases, like whether if there was a perfect correlation, so you could not devise a study where you just like increase the like masking time or something a little bit between conscious and discriminability, that would be sort of like supportive. So
I think we should try to do something like this, at least where even if it's not, note that the match performance thing is good because we can design conditions that are even not perfectly unconscious, but as long as we get this these two conditions that differ with respect to consciousness but are equal with respect to performance. So for example, maybe those 2 points here, then we can get a handle on the functions of consciousness, which functions are facilitated by consciousness. That's fine.
In something like this, though, you're matching them at the group level, right? Are you concerned that at the trial level, you're getting something unconscious or less discriminable? And don't you have to do some kind of matching at the trial level to
Yeah, that's
the case?
That's a very good point. Well, you'll need to do it at the individual level for one condition. Because the thing is that at a trial level, we have no idea what discrimination is or what, because obviously discrimination is across many files. Any particular file could be like luck or bad luck. And therefore, we don't know what consciousness looks like on a particular file. The only thing we can do is look for across many files, but we can do that for one individual, for one condition.
At least at the subject level.
At the subject level, we should be able to do that.
Over this.
Yeah.
So just very quick, there are studies that have done that actually, and that show parallel performance and eye movement, but when you do a trial by trial correlation, the correlation is nil completely.
Okay.
I will show that slide.
What Matthias says.
I'm afraid we're out of time, so let's thank Matthias.